The Americas have truly a fascinating beginning, one unlike many, where we can trace the beginnings of our nation from the North Americas to Mesoamerica, South America. The colonization of Americas that we've discussed this week have been absolutely fascinating to me. A lot of things, I guess, we probably covered through elementary social studies and into high school American history, through even some of American government. But I feel like I've forgotten more than I knew. So this week, when we started out with, from the beginning, really, the Spanish conquests of Mesoamerica, moving up into the North Americas, like Florida, Fort Lauderdale, all that kind of thing, I was actually really surprised. I had heard of what Columbus had done and all these atrocities, and everybody hates Columbus today because I guess that's what's cool, is to hate Columbus. But to actually read that the way that he went about colonizing the Americas, the way that he befriended and kind of took advantage of smaller tribes and then decimated the larger tribes like the Aztecs, the Inca, the Maya, and the way that the Spanish basically destroyed an entire civilization, claiming this kind of holier than thou sort of Christianity, but it was, the Catholicism of Christianizing the pagans was kind of their goal in mind, looking for gold, looking for power, looking to expand. I think it was fascinating. One of the biggest points from that earlier point in history was, for me, when the Spanish moved up, founded Mexico City, and then there was that one conquest that went up north, up into the New Mexico region, and where they went against the Sky City and all the Pueblo Indians, and the way that they absolutely demolished half the population, went in there and slaughtered 50% of the men, women, and the children. And then they went through and chopped the foot off of every male over 15 years old because they didn't want them to run. They were going to be slaves, and they enslaved all the other women and children. Was absolutely fascinating to me, and that was kind of the birth of the Black Legend that motivated a lot of the European response to the Spanish conquests of the Americas and the native peoples. And then you move into more like where the Dutch went up into the north, and then you have the British who landed in the Chesapeake Bay. Was just fascinating for me. The Jamestown story alone, the real story of Jamestown, I think, is way better than the Disney Pocahontas movie. You have John Smith raising up, who gets these people, these noblemen who signed this contract to come over and probably planned on using indentured servitude, legal slavery. All slavery back then was legal, but you know what I mean. Using indentured servitude of the lower class and the poorer nations to farm out their land and bring in crops and survive. But none of that happened. None of that worked the way that they expected it to. So then you had to have a strong leader rise up. So John Smith, according to what we have in history, rose up. And as far-fetched as it seems, he got these people to either starve to death or work for their food. So these noblemen were working alongside, if they weren't starving to death, they were working alongside lower class. And I feel like that was one of those foundational moments for kind of what America has become, as far as the differences. Because even today, the class system is still existing in Britain. You still have upper class, lower class, north and south, middle class is in there somewhere. There's all these different complicated classes that still exist over in Europe today, but in America, it's far less defined. Now the people who make the most money tend to be the hardest workers and the ones who have worked for it the most and kind of been on that grind to get to where they are today. So a lot of CEOs and business people, they had to grind their way through bad jobs, they had to grind their way through college, and they had to work their way up in a company. So it's not like we're born into this royalty and this like we used to be. So I find that very, very fascinating. That my wife's back there in the background as well. Sorry. So they kind of broke down the class system and forcing these rich nobles to work alongside those, and it was really a humbling experience for them. And I think it contributed to the eventual survival of the colony. Another thing that was a little bit later on after John Smith leaves, in that winter period of 1609 and 1610, I found that absolutely amazing. I had never heard that story before, what had happened in Jamestown during that period in history. Which, again, just to recap, just to demonstrate the knowledge of the event, found it so crazy that imagine being a settler waiting for a boat to come in. The winter's coming. You can tell it's going to be a bad one. You can tell it's going to be a really bad winter. Low on supplies. You're waiting for a ship to arrive that has your food and all your stock to get you through the winter until the spring comes. Only to discover it's not coming. It was lost at sea. There are no supplies coming from England for you. So now, what do? You're facing starvation. And so people did the best that they could. They lasted with what they had. And before long, they were taking their own, all the livestock was gone. Horses were gone. The mice and the rats were gone. I've thought about, like, well, why didn't they go hunting? I imagine that the winter was so bad that there just weren't any animals out there either. And if there were, they were designed for it. The British settlers were not. So how could they go out there and expect to survive to hunt when they couldn't even stay next to their fireplace and they were freezing to death and starving to death? So before long, they resorted to even boiling their leather shoes and jackets and saddles and eating them, because at least it would make you feel full for a little while. People were digging up corpses of people who were deceased and recently deceased and eating the corpses of people. And according to our reading, there was even one man who was arrested and executed for killing and eating his wife. And then later on in that same reading, it talked about a 14-year-old girl who had been excavated in 2012, I believe it was, and she showed all these signs of cannibalism. Like, they had dug her up, they ate her, and then they reburied her, just her bones. So it's crazy to see what people resorted to. And then in the end, after all was said and done, after all these horrible atrocities were taking place, in the name of survival, which it's terrible, it was desperate, there were only 60 people left in that colony when people arrived after the spring thaw. Just imagine, I don't think there's been a more desperate moment for such a large group of people where now everybody's gone, everybody's dead, there's nobody left. Which is absolutely fascinating to me. I'd never heard those stories before. Then seeing what had happened with the Dutch colonies and the way that they expanded, and that was really interesting as well. So the ancestors of, like, the Pennsylvania Dutch and all that stuff, and seeing how they used a lot of indentured servitude. They used a lot of the ideas of trading with the natives, the crossbreeding and stuff like that, which was all super interesting. It was actually very similar to the way that the Spanish were crossbreeding kind of with the more smaller tribes that were more easily controllable. But I think that the most interesting thing for me was about the Dutch part of it anyway. The most interesting thing for me was when they arrived. I had always thought that, the Americans and that the Europeans and, people were responsible for causing smallpox in the Native American populations. But I don't see that in the facts of what we read today. Now, I know later on after the Civil War, it got really bad. Around the time of the Civil War, after America was founded, so I'm talking like post-1776, was still really bad. That was America. That was definitely us. But referring specifically to the Dutch, when they arrived, the remaining survivors in the area had actually just been through one of the worst smallpox outbreaks that have ever happened. I believe it was 90 or 95% of the population had been absolutely decimated by smallpox. And so this small remnant of survivors was basically looking at the Dutch and saying, hey, we can be friends. So it's pretty interesting. The Pilgrims and everything, it's so crazy what happened with the New England area. And what became New York, Manhattan Island, and all the facts that, like, the way that we founded these colonies is just so amazing to me. And since the readings and since the videos of this past week, it's just amazing because I look at maps. I work in classrooms all day. I actually pull cable and do wire and do Wi-Fi. So I'm in a lot of different classrooms all throughout my county. And every time I stop, I have to stop and look at a map and just look at the Chesapeake Bay region and just look at Manhattan Island and the Atlantic Ocean and the expanse that the European settlers had to come across to get over to the Americas. And I'm just fascinated every time. It's like a lot of terrible things happened, but I honestly believe that it was absolutely an act of God that they made it over here and were able to successfully establish colonies and expand. Because none of us would, most of us would not be here today had it not been for what our ancestors did, both good and bad. And that kind of reflects over into the modern area and what we see today. Like I said, I spoke about the class system and those types of things that were broken that we can definitely still see the remnants of today. And I think that one of those things is our multicultural, the melting pot that we are in this country was kind of what happened from the Spanish first landing on their boats until the English Reformation when the British, the European Reformation when the British started coming over here and the Dutch started coming over here as well. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day. Be blessed. Bye-bye.